Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is the last debate for the 1968 presidential election. If you would like to state any more statements about your campaign, please do so now.
Good evening, the fellow Americans. My name is Richard Nixon. I will be running for president in this election, and I would like to say that if I am elected, I will withdraw the troops from Vietnam and transfer all the responsibility to the South Vietnamese government. Also, I pledge that we will have an honorable end to the Vietnam War. And remember, peace with honor.
Well, me as Humphrey, I feel as if this is an era that must end, and we must start a new era, and I feel as if it gone with LBJ and in with Humphrey. So if I'm elected, I will bring us out of war, but I will bring it in a way that it will not cause us any more trouble. I feel as if this is a new era, and we shall create it together if I am elected. The Humphrey era.
The results are in for the 1968 presidential election. And the winner is, by the people's vote, Herbert Humphrey.
I knew it. Humphrey.
Wait! There's been a discrepancy in the voting. The actual winner is Mr. Nixon, Richard Nixon.
Yes, thank you, my Richard. You will not regret this decision. I will end the war. I will end the war. Thank you, thank you.
So, how would you explain the life of 1960, like your life in that time?
1968?
Well, around that time.
Well, in 1968, I was, I was not actually old enough to vote, because you couldn't vote until you were 21 years old, and I wasn't 21 years old in 1968. But I remember the presidential election campaign, and I actually worked on it. I actually worked on the campaign, because you could volunteer even if you weren't old enough to vote, and I had done that. I was in college in 1968. I would have been halfway through college in 1968. So I was an undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin, so I vividly remember the campaign.
What would you say was the impact of the silent majority?
Well, the theory of the campaign, Barry Goldwater, and it has echoes of the kind of campaign that you hear about some now. The kind of the theory of the silent majority is that there are a lot of people who don't vote, who, if they are engaged by the particular message of a candidate, can be drawn into voting, and that if you look at any election in the history of the country, that there are more eligible voters who choose not to vote than there are voters who choose to vote. That's not actually statistically true, but sometimes it's been close to true. I mean, we typically have had voter turnout rates in this country for the general election that were in the 50 to 55% range, sometimes as high as 65% in the 20th century, from the 20th century to today. We have typically a majority of people actually voting. But the theory of the silent majority is that if the people who chose not to vote did choose to vote, they could change the outcome of elections. That's probably true, but from a political science point of view, it's probably irrelevant, because the silent majority, that silent group, would line up in very much the same way as the group that's voting, because part of the message of silence is agreement. And some of the message of silence is disengagement. You know, I don't care, they don't do anything for me, why should I bother? But part of the message of silence is, it's fine, my life is fine, nothing's going to change very significantly, so it really doesn't make a huge difference.
Interesting.
It's a good theory, but it's not necessarily a plausible theory.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually know about that. I just,
Well, every politician wants to connect with the public in some kind of unique way. And so every politician tries to craft a message that brings a particular constituency to the polls to support them on behalf of that message. I mean, that's the whole point of having a political campaign, is to be able to promulgate a message and see if you can get people to come to your support for that message. To the extent that people divide between messengers, then that tells us that people are not overwhelmed by the validity of any one particular message. And if you look at election results, and the current primaries are a good example, the winner in any one of the states, with a few exceptions, the winner in any one of the states didn't get as many votes as the people who didn't win. So for all of the crowing about, I won this state, more people voted against that perspective than voted for that perspective. Now there's some exceptions to that. In the case of this last Tuesday, there were a couple of home states that voted very heavily for the candidate that was their favored candidate, their more local candidate. And you typically see that. If you look at the returns from a candidate's home state and you see that division between multiple candidates and you don't see a really strong majority opinion coming from the supporters of that state to that candidate has a weak message. Because if that candidate's at less than 50% of the acknowledged vote, then they're not winning the majority, not even of their own home state, because the majority voted for someone else. That plays into the whole theory of silent majority, because I can win any election with one vote. That's why every vote counts, because the winning margin in any election is one vote. It's the vote that puts you past the other candidate. It's the vote that puts your idea into the majority. We don't have a plurality system. That's why with multiple candidates in the field right now, we're trying to narrow that field down, because we eventually have a contest between candidates in the presidency. We have a contest between candidates nominated by political parties, and then they go head to head. But right now in the preliminaries and primaries, we're looking at multiple candidates and multiple perspectives and trying to figure out if there really is a defined message that's taking people and exciting them and making them come out to vote. The answer right now is no. It's very clear. The answer is no. So, particularly in one party, not so much in the other. But we can see that. So the theory of the silent majority is that somehow there's this large reservoir of voters out there that are not participating that could make a huge difference. And theoretically, yeah, they could. But realistically, no, they wouldn't, because they would line up just like everybody else.
and in your personal opinion, what do you think how the credibility gap helped Nixon win the election of 1968?
Well, Robert McNamara and the Department of Defense had not been as forthcoming about the casualties in Vietnam as had been published. Not a particularly unusual tactic, by the way. Getting casualty numbers out of a war zone is always a very tricky undertaking. The advent of almost instantaneous communication with satellites and engendered investigative reporting and uncovering of details. And we see with the Vietnam War the beginning of a trend to distrust the government even more, perhaps, than had been there previously. I guess the best I can say is there's always been a credibility gap. When the Federalist prevailed and achieved the adoption of the Constitution, the anti-Federalist would argue that there was a credibility gap. They might not call it that, but they would argue that there had been manipulation, that people had not been told everything they needed to know, that the implications of the language of the Constitution were not fully vetted. So I think you can make an argument that there has never been a government in history where there was not a gap between what people believed should be the performance of government and what people perceived was the performance of government. There's a natural animosity between the people who are on the outside and the people who are on the inside, and there's always suspicion. In this country, our politicians play on that at times to get elected. And I don't think there's any question, but it played a role in the election of Richard Nixon. He was a Quaker. I don't know if you've come across that in your research. He was a Quaker. Quakers are anti-war. The Quakers are a sect in Christianity, but they are particularly a sect that is opposed to violence. Not just war, but violence in a more general sort of way. His mother was a Quaker, he was raised a Quaker. So one of his points of credibility in terms of his promise to end the conflict in Vietnam was the fact that he was a Quaker, a pacifist, and his opposition was not. He was a hawk who was willing to be more aggressive. You hear that same kind of language in every in every generation, in every political contest. Which side is more militaristic than the other side? That's always a measure of one side's credibility versus the other. National security, our boundaries, all of that comes to play in presidential elections, always does. When there's been a conflict like Vietnam, and you're embroiled in the middle of a conflict,